She walked into the briefing room with dirt still under her fingernails from loading cargo crates. The male pilots barely glanced up from their maps and coffee cups. To them, she was just another transport pilot, someone who flew supplies from point A to point B while the real pilots handled the dangerous missions. They had no idea that in less than 6 hours, this woman would rewrite the history books. They didn't know about the countless hours she'd spent in secret training sessions, pushing aging aircraft to their absolute limits. They couldn't see the fire burning behind her calm exterior, or the years of frustration she'd channeled into becoming something extraordinary. They simply saw what they expected to see, a woman in a support role. But when enemy fighters appeared on the horizon that morning, when the odds were 12-1 against survival, when every conventional pilot would have turned and run, she didn't just stand her ground. She turned her supposedly defenseless transport aircraft into a weapon of legend. This is the story of how 24 minutes changed everything anyone thought they knew about courage, skill, and the deadly mistake of underestimating someone based on their assigned role. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for generations. But it started with a woman who refused to accept the limits others placed on her dreams. Lieutenant Sarah Chun had stopped trying to prove herself to the men in Squadron 47 6 months ago. Every morning, she watched them gather around the mission board, their voices rising with excitement as they discussed air-to-air combat scenarios and tactical maneuvers. When she approached, conversations died like candles in the wind. "Transport duty again," Major Williams announced without looking up from his clipboard. "Supply run to Firebase Delta. Medical supplies and ammunition should be routine." Sarah nodded and took the assignment sheet. Around her, the other pilots received their missions: reconnaissance flights over enemy territory, escort duties for bombing runs, combat air patrols. Real pilot work, they called it. Her work was just flying trucks with wings. She walked to her aircraft, a modified C-130 Hercules that had seen better decades. The maintenance crew was finishing their pre-flight checks, and Chief Mechanic Rodriguez gave her a wave. "Morning, Lieutenant. Bird's running smooth today. New engine filters installed yesterday." "Thanks, Chief. How's the defensive systems check out?" Rodriguez paused in his work, looking surprised. The C-130 carried basic defensive equipment, nothing compared to the fighters. "Everything's green, though I still don't understand why you keep requesting those system checks. This bird's not built for combat." Sarah smiled but didn't explain. She'd been studying every technical manual she could find, learning the capabilities of every system on her aircraft. While the other pilots assumed she was just being thorough, she was actually preparing for something else entirely. The truth was that Sarah had been a combat pilot before her transfer to transport duty. 3 years ago, she'd been flying F-16 Fighting Falcons with the best of them. She'd scored 2 confirmed kills during border skirmishes and had received commendations for her precision and tactical thinking. But then came the incident that changed everything. During a training exercise, she disobeyed direct orders to engage enemy aircraft that were threatening a downed pilot. Her actions saved the pilot's life, but the commanding officer saw it as insubordination. The official report stated that she lacked the discipline necessary for fighter operations and recommended her transfer to support roles. The real reason, Sarah knew, was simpler. She was too good, and it made the male pilots uncomfortable. She'd outperformed most of them in training scores, but when promotion time came, she was mysteriously overlooked. When she questioned the decisions, she was labeled as difficult to work with. So here she was, flying cargo runs while fighting a daily battle against bitterness and frustration. But Sarah had made a decision during those long months of routine flights. She would not let them break her spirit. Instead, she would become something they never expected. Late at night, when the base was quiet, Sarah would study combat manuals and aircraft specifications. She memorized the performance capabilities of every fighter aircraft in the regional air forces. She learned about missile systems, defensive countermeasures, and air-to-air combat tactics. Most importantly, she studied her own aircraft with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The C-130 Hercules was designed as a cargo transport, but Sarah discovered that its robust construction and powerful engines gave it capabilities that most people never considered. With the right modifications and the right pilot, it could become something entirely unexpected. She'd convinced Chief Rodriguez to help her install additional defensive systems under the guise of enhanced protection for high-risk supply runs. The chief, who'd served with Sarah's father in Vietnam, had quietly added electronic countermeasures and upgraded the aircraft's radar systems. On paper, it was still just a transport plane. In reality, it was becoming something much more dangerous. The morning of September 15th started like any other. Sarah completed her pre-flight checks and filed her flight plan for Firebase Delta, a remote outpost near the border where tensions had been escalating for weeks. Intelligence reports suggested increased enemy activity in the region, but transport flights were considered low-priority targets. As she taxied toward the runway, Sarah noticed unusual activity on the fighter flight line. Ground crews were working frantically to prepare additional aircraft, and she could see pilots running toward their fighters. Something was happening, but no one had bothered to inform the transport pilots. "Tower, this is Transport 77 requesting clearance for departure," Sarah radioed. "Transport 77, you're cleared for takeoff. Be advised, we have reports of increased air activity in your sector. Maintain radio contact and report any unusual sightings." Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly. This was it, the opportunity she'd been preparing for without knowing when it might come. She advanced the throttles and felt the familiar surge of power as the C-130 accelerated down the runway. As she climbed to cruising altitude, Sarah's radio crackled with urgent transmissions. Fighter Command was scrambling additional aircraft to investigate reports of unidentified contacts approaching the border. The enemy was testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses. 20 minutes into her flight, Sarah's enhanced radar systems began picking up contacts that shouldn't have been there. Multiple aircraft, flying in formation, approaching from the northeast. They were still beyond visual range, but their flight pattern and speed suggested military fighters. "Command, this is Transport 77. I'm tracking multiple unidentified contacts bearing 045, estimated 12 aircraft in formation." The response was immediate and sharp. "Transport 77, alter course immediately. Return to base. Fighters are being scrambled to investigate." Sarah looked at her instruments, calculating distances and response times. The nearest friendly fighters were at least 15 minutes away. The unidentified aircraft would reach Firebase Delta in 8 minutes. She thought about the soldiers at the remote outpost, good people who depended on air support that wouldn't arrive in time. For a moment, she wavered. Following orders meant turning around and letting others handle the situation. It was the safe choice, the expected choice. But as she watched the enemy contacts growing larger on her radar screen, Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her career. Instead of turning toward home, she banked toward the approaching aircraft. Her hands moved over the control panels with practiced efficiency, activating systems that most transport pilots never used. Electronic warfare equipment hummed to life, and defensive countermeasures came online. The C-130 Hercules was about to become something its designers never intended. A fighter aircraft flown by a pilot with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Sarah keyed her radio one more time. "Command, Transport 77 is engaging. Time to show them what a transport pilot can really do." The enemy fighters were now visible as specks on the horizon, growing larger with each passing second. In 5 minutes, the most extraordinary air battle of the decade would begin, and Sarah Chun was about to remind everyone why underestimating someone is the most dangerous mistake you can make in combat. She whispered a quick prayer, checked her weapons systems one final time, and prepared to turn 24 minutes into legend. The enemy fighters materialized out of the morning haze like deadly shadows. Sarah counted 12 aircraft in a loose formation, their sleek profiles unmistakable even at distance. These were seasoned pilots flying advanced fighters, not the inexperienced crews that usually tested border defenses. "Transport 77, you are ordered to withdraw immediately." The voice from command crackled through her headset with barely controlled panic. "Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage." Sarah switched off her radio. She'd heard enough orders for one lifetime. The lead enemy aircraft was now close enough for her to identify. MiG-29 Fulcrums, painted in desert camouflage and bearing no national markings. Professional mercenaries or elite Air Force pilots operating under false flags. Either way, they were here for one reason: to destroy Firebase Delta and everyone in it. Sarah's enhanced radar systems were tracking all 12 aircraft now, and her computer was calculating intercept courses and engagement angles. The C-130's defensive systems were designed to confuse and evade enemy missiles, but Sarah had been studying ways to turn defense into offense. The first enemy pilot made his mistake by assuming she would run. Lieutenant Colonel Viktor Petrov had been flying fighters for 15 years and had never seen a transport aircraft behave like this one. Instead of fleeing or calling for help, the large, lumbering C-130 was actually turning toward his formation. He almost laughed at the absurdity. All aircraft, this is lead. Target appears to be confused. Single transport attempting to block our approach. Dispose of it quickly and continue to primary target. But as Petrov closed to missile range, something unexpected happened. The transport aircraft suddenly dropped altitude and began a series of evasive maneuvers that seemed impossible for such a large plane. Moreover, his missile lock kept breaking as the aircraft deployed chaff and electronic countermeasures with perfect timing. Sarah felt the familiar rush of combat as she dove toward the deck, using the C-130's surprising agility to throw off the enemy's targeting systems. She'd spent months studying the flight characteristics of her aircraft, learning to push it far beyond normal operational limits. The first MiG-29 overshot her position, its pilot clearly confused by her unconventional tactics. As it passed overhead, Sarah activated one of her secret modifications, a rear-facing defensive system that Chief Rodriguez had installed under the cargo bay. The system wasn't designed to shoot down aircraft, it was meant to disable missiles and electronic systems. But when the electromagnetic pulse hit the MiG-29's engine control unit at close range, the effect was devastating. The enemy fighter's engines flamed out simultaneously, and Sarah watched in satisfaction as the pilot ejected from his dead aircraft. One down, 11 to go. What the hell just happened? Petrov's voice cut through the radio chatter as he watched his wingman's aircraft spiral toward the ground. The transport plane was still flying, still maneuvering, and now was turning toward his position with what looked suspiciously like aggressive intent. Sarah's second target was a pilot who thought he was clever. He'd positioned himself above and behind her aircraft, planning to attack from her blind spot. What he didn't know was that Sarah had installed additional mirrors and sensors that gave her nearly 360-degree vision. She waited until he committed to his attack run, then executed a maneuver that should have been impossible in a C-130, a sharp climbing turn combined with full deployment of chaff and flares. The enemy pilot, expecting an easy shot at a defenseless transport, flew straight into a cloud of electronic interference. His missiles went wide, confused by the countermeasures. But Sarah wasn't finished with him. As he passed below her aircraft, she dropped altitude rapidly and activated her emergency cargo doors. The sudden change in her aircraft's aerodynamics created a massive air disturbance that caught the enemy fighter like a fly in a spider web. The MiG-29 tumbled out of control, its pilot fighting desperately to regain stability. By the time he recovered, Sarah had positioned herself for a perfect deflection shot with her defensive systems. Another electromagnetic pulse disabled his navigation and communication equipment, leaving him effectively blind and deaf. The pilot, realizing his aircraft was compromised, made the smart choice and ejected. Sarah watched his parachute deploy as his fighter crashed into an empty field below. 2 down, 10 to go. But now the enemy was taking her seriously. The remaining fighters had spread out and were approaching from multiple angles, their pilots communicating rapidly in a foreign language. Sarah didn't need to understand their words to know what they were planning, a coordinated attack that would overwhelm her defenses. She had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached optimal firing position. Time for her most dangerous gambit yet. Sarah dove toward the ground, pushing her aircraft's speed beyond normal limits. The C-130 wasn't built for high-speed flight, but she'd learned to use gravity and engine power to achieve velocities that surprised even experienced pilots. More importantly, she was heading toward a narrow mountain canyon that would force the enemy fighters to approach her in single file. "She's running for the mountains," one of the enemy pilots reported. "Cut her off before she reaches the canyon." But Sarah wasn't running. She was creating the tactical situation she needed to turn a 12-1 disadvantage into something manageable. In the narrow confines of the canyon, the enemy's numerical superiority would mean nothing. They'd have to come at her one at a time, and in that environment, her unconventional tactics would be most effective. The first enemy fighter followed her into the canyon, its pilot confident in his aircraft's superior speed and maneuverability. What he didn't expect was for Sarah to suddenly reverse direction using a technique she'd learned from studying aerobatic manuals. The C-130 performed what pilots call a hammerhead stall, climbing vertically until it lost all forward momentum, then falling backward in a controlled slide before resuming normal flight in the opposite direction. The maneuver was risky and required perfect timing, but it positioned Sarah behind the enemy fighter just as he was committing to his attack run. This time, she used her most powerful defensive system, a focused electromagnetic burst that could temporarily disable electronic systems at short range. The pulse hit the MiG-29's flight control computers just as the pilot was pulling out of his dive, and the aircraft immediately became uncontrollable. The fighter crashed into the canyon wall in a ball of flame, its pilot never having a chance to eject. 3 down, 9 to go. Sarah climbed out of the canyon to find the remaining enemy aircraft regrouping for another attack. But now she could see uncertainty in their movements. They'd lost 3 aircraft to a transport plane, something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Their formation was looser, their approaches more cautious. For the first time since the engagement began, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. They were starting to fear her, and fear was a weapon she could use. Her radio crackled back to life as she switched to the emergency frequency. "Any Allied aircraft, this is Transport 77. I am engaged with 9 enemy fighters approximately 15 miles northeast of Firebase Delta. Could use some backup if anyone's in the neighborhood." The response came immediately from an unexpected source. "Transport 77, this is Delta Base Commander. Hold your position. Reinforcements are en route." And Lieutenant Good Hunting. Sarah's heart swelled with pride. Someone was finally taking her seriously, treating her like the fighter pilot she'd always been inside. But she didn't have time to savor the moment. The enemy aircraft were forming up for what looked like their final coordinated attack. 9 fighters against 1 transport plane. In any reasonable scenario, the outcome would be predetermined. But Sarah Chun had stopped being reasonable the moment she decided to engage. She was operating on instinct, training, and a burning desire to prove that courage and skill mattered more than the aircraft you flew. The next phase of the battle would test every lesson she'd learned and push her aircraft to the absolute limit of its capabilities. But as she watched the enemy fighters approach, Sarah felt calm and focused. She'd already achieved the impossible. Now, she was going to do it 8 more times. The remaining 9 enemy fighters had learned from their fallen comrades' mistakes. Instead of approaching Sarah's position with overconfidence, they were now treating her like a legitimate threat. Their formation had spread wide, forcing her to divide her attention across multiple attack vectors. Sarah's fuel gauge showed she had perhaps 20 minutes of fighting time remaining. Her defensive systems were operating at maximum capacity, generating heat signatures that would soon require cooling cycles. Most critically, she was running low on chaff and electronic countermeasures. Every shot had a count now. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov's voice cut through the radio chatter, speaking to his remaining pilots in accented English. "This pilot is not ordinary. She knows our tactics and has prepared countermeasures. We finish this now together. No more single attacks." Sarah intercepted the transmission and felt a cold smile cross her face. Finally, an enemy commander who understood what he was facing. But understanding and defeating were 2 different things entirely. The first wave came from 3 directions simultaneously. Sarah had anticipated this coordination and was already implementing a defensive strategy she'd designed during those long nights of studying combat manuals. Instead of trying to evade all 3 attacks, She would create a situation where the enemy pilots would interfere with each other. She climbed rapidly while deploying every piece of electronic countermeasure she possessed, creating a massive electronic signature that lit up enemy radar screens like a Christmas tree. The three attacking fighters adjusted their approach angles to compensate for what they perceived as evasive action. What they didn't realize was that Sarah was deliberately making herself a more obvious target to draw them into a specific geometric relationship. As the three MiG-29s converged on her position, their flight paths began to intersect in ways their pilots hadn't calculated. At the critical moment, Sarah executed a split-S maneuver, diving inverted and pulling through to reverse her direction. The C-130 groaned under the stress, but the aircraft held together as she'd known it would. The three enemy fighters, committed to their attack runs at high speed, suddenly found themselves in each other's way. The lead pilot tried to brake left just as his wingman broke right. The third fighter, approaching from below, had no choice but to pull up sharply to avoid collision. In that moment of confusion, with all three aircraft's attention focused on not colliding with each other, Sarah struck. Her electromagnetic pulse system fired 3 times in rapid succession, each burst carefully timed to hit a different aircraft. The lead fighter's navigation system failed completely, leaving the pilot flying blind in thick cloud cover. The second aircraft lost its weapons control systems, effectively removing it from combat. The third fighter suffered a catastrophic failure of its flight control computers and began an uncontrolled descent. 2 pilots ejected immediately. The third, either too proud or too stubborn to abandon his aircraft, attempted to regain control manually. Sarah watched with professional respect as he fought his dying fighter for nearly 30 seconds before physics won, and he was forced to eject. 6 down, 6 to go. But Sarah's victory came at a cost. The rapid maneuvering had stressed her aircraft beyond normal limits, and she could hear concerning sounds from the engines. Moreover, her defensive systems were overheating from continuous use. She needed to end this battle quickly, before her aircraft failed completely. The remaining 6 enemy fighters had learned yet another lesson. Their opponent was not just skilled, she was strategically brilliant. They regrouped at a safe distance, clearly discussing new tactics while keeping Sarah under long-range observation. During this brief respite, Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from friendly forces. Transport 77, this is Falcon Leader. We're 5 minutes out with a full squadron. Can you maintain until we arrive? Sarah checked her fuel, her system status, and the positions of the remaining enemy aircraft. 5 minutes might as well be 5 hours in air combat terms. But she keyed her microphone anyway. Falcon Leader, this is 77. I'll be here when you arrive. These guys picked the wrong transport pilot to mess with. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov had been monitoring friendly radio transmissions and knew that enemy reinforcements were approaching. His mission was supposed to have been completed 10 minutes ago with minimal losses. Instead, he lost half his squadron to a single transport aircraft flown by someone who fought like she was personally offended by their presence. All aircraft, new priority. We eliminate this transport immediately, then withdraw before enemy fighters arrive. Attack pattern Delta, surround, and overwhelm. The 6 remaining fighters spread out in a perfect circle around Sarah's position, each pilot positioning himself for a simultaneous attack from a different angle. It was a flawless tactical formation designed to overwhelm any defensive system through sheer volume of fire. Sarah recognized the pattern immediately. She'd studied this exact formation in advanced combat manuals, and she knew there was only one effective counter-tactic. It required perfect timing, complete commitment, and a level of flying skill that pushed human capabilities to their limits. As the enemy fighters began their final approach, Sarah did something that violated every principle of defensive flying. She turned off her defensive systems and began climbing directly toward the center of their formation. To the enemy pilots, it looked like mechanical failure or pilot panic. A transport aircraft climbing into the middle of 6 attacking fighters was committing suicide. They adjusted their attack vectors to converge on her new position, confident that the battle was finally over. But Sarah had calculated something they hadn't considered. By climbing into the center of their formation, she was creating a situation where any missed shots would threaten other attacking aircraft. Moreover, she was forcing them to attack at steep angles that reduced their accuracy and maneuverability. At precisely the right moment, when all 6 fighters were committed to their attack runs and could no longer alter their flight paths, Sarah activated her most powerful defensive system and simultaneously released her entire remaining supply of chaff and flares. The result was spectacular. The C-130 disappeared inside a massive cloud of electronic interference and heat signatures, becoming invisible to both radar and heat-seeking missiles. The 6 attacking fighters, suddenly deprived of their target, found themselves firing at shadows while flying directly toward each other at combat speed. What followed was the most chaotic 30 seconds of air combat Sarah had ever witnessed. Enemy aircraft were braking left and right, desperately trying to avoid collisions while their missiles chased false targets through the electronic maze she'd created. Radio chatter exploded with panicked voices calling out warnings and vectors. When the interference cleared, 2 more enemy fighters were gone. One had collided with another during the confusion, sending both aircraft spiraling toward the ground in a twisted embrace of metal and flame. Neither pilot survived. Down from that engagement alone. 8 total. To go. But Sarah's aircraft was now operating on fumes and prayers. Her engines were running rough from the extreme maneuvering, and several warning lights were flashing on her control panel. She had perhaps 3 minutes of combat capability remaining before mechanical failure forced her to withdraw. The 4 surviving enemy pilots had finally learned the lesson their training should have taught them. Never underestimate your opponent, regardless of what aircraft they're flying. They approached Sarah's position with careful precision, maintaining safe distances while probing for weaknesses in her defenses. Sarah's radio came alive with a transmission that made her heart soar. Transport 77, this is Falcon Leader. We have you on radar. Enemy aircraft are marked. Beginning our attack, run now. Through her canopy, Sarah could see the contrails of approaching F-16 fighting Falcons. For aircraft flown by pilots she'd trained with years ago. The cavalry was finally arriving, but the remaining enemy fighters had seen them too and were preparing to withdraw. Sarah faced a choice. She could maintain her position and let the enemy escape to fight another day, or she could use her last minutes of combat capability to ensure they never threatened anyone again. For someone who'd spent years being told she wasn't aggressive enough for fighter operations, there was really no choice at all. Sarah turned toward the fleeing enemy aircraft and pushed her engines to maximum power. The C-130 Hercules, designed to carry cargo across continents, began its final charge against 4 of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. What happened next will be talked about in pilot training schools for decades to come. The 4 surviving enemy fighters were running for their lives, but they were making one final tactical error. They assumed a damaged transport aircraft couldn't possibly catch them. Sarah had been counting on that assumption. During her months of studying the C-130's capabilities, she discovered that the aircraft could achieve remarkable speed in a shallow dive with engines at emergency power. The technique was dangerous. It stressed the airframe beyond design limits and consumed fuel at a catastrophic rate. But for short periods, she could match the cruising speed of most fighter aircraft. More importantly, she'd calculated that the fleeing enemy fighters would have to climb to clear the mountain range ahead. That climb would slow them down just enough for her to close the distance she needed. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov was experiencing something he'd never felt in 15 years of combat flying. Genuine fear of another pilot. The transport aircraft behind him had done the impossible not once, but repeatedly. 8 of his best pilots were gone, defeated by someone flying an aircraft that shouldn't have posed any threat at all. Falcon Leader, this is 7-7, Sarah radioed to the approaching F-16s. I'm in pursuit of 4 enemy fighters bearing 270. They're climbing to clear the mountains. I can intercept before they reach the border. Negative 7-7. RTB immediately. Your aircraft appears damaged, and you're critically low on fuel. We'll handle the remaining hostiles. Sarah checked her fuel gauge and engine status. Falcon Leader was absolutely right. She had perhaps 90 seconds of flight time remaining before she'd be forced to attempt an emergency landing. But 90 seconds was exactly what she needed. Copy, Falcon Leader. Just give me 1 minute to finish what I started. The enemy fighters were beginning their climb now, their sleek forms silhouetted against the morning sky. Sarah had positioned herself perfectly for an intercept course that would bring her within range just as they reached their most vulnerable point: maximum climb angle, minimum maneuverability. Her targeting systems locked onto the trailing aircraft, but Sarah hesitated. She'd been using non-lethal methods throughout the engagement, disabling aircraft rather than destroying them outright. But these last 4 pilots had proven they would keep coming back unless permanently stopped. The decision was made for her when the enemy formation leader fired a missile at maximum range, a desperate attempt to disable her aircraft before she could close distance. Sarah watched the missile's exhaust trail arc toward her position and felt something cold settle in her chest. They'd escalated to lethal force. Now she would respond in kind. Sarah activated her final modification, the one Chief Rodriguez had installed reluctantly and swore never to discuss with anyone. Hidden in the C-130's cargo bay was a single air-to-air missile, salvaged from a damaged F-16 and carefully integrated into her aircraft's targeting systems. It was her last resort, her ace in the hole. The enemy missile passed harmlessly below her aircraft, confused by chaff deployment and electronic countermeasures. But now Sarah was within range for her own shot, and she had a perfect firing solution on the trailing enemy fighter. Transport 7-7, what are you doing? Falcon Leader's voice carried concern and confusion. Your aircraft doesn't have offensive capabilities. About that, Sarah murmured and pulled the trigger. The missile leaped from the C-130's cargo bay like an arrow released from a bow. The enemy pilot, focused on his climb and unaware that a transport aircraft could carry such weapons, had no time to react. The missile struck his aircraft's center mass, and the MiG-29 disintegrated in a fireball that lit up the morning sky. 9 down, 3 to go. But Sarah's aircraft had finally reached its limits. The emergency power settings had pushed her engines beyond their tolerance, and she could feel the C-130 beginning to vibrate in ways that suggested imminent mechanical failure. Black smoke was starting to trail from her port engine, and her control responses were becoming sluggish. The 3 remaining enemy fighters had witnessed the destruction of their comrade, and were now in full retreat, abandoning all pretense of tactical withdrawal. They dove toward the deck, using the terrain to mask their escape while pushing their aircraft to maximum speed. Sarah tried to follow, but her damaged aircraft wouldn't respond. The port engine was losing power rapidly, and she was fighting to maintain altitude on 3 engines. Her incredible 24-minute battle was finally coming to an end. 7-7, this is Falcon Leader. We're taking over pursuit. You've done enough. More than enough. Sarah leveled off and began a slow turn toward home base, her fuel gauges showing almost empty tanks. Through her rearview mirrors, she watched the F-16 streak past her position in pursuit of the fleeing enemy fighters. The battle was over, and somehow impossibly she had survived. But as she began her descent toward the emergency landing field at Firebase Delta, Sarah's radio crackled with an urgent transmission that made her blood run cold. All aircraft, this is Delta Base. We have 3 additional enemy fighters approaching from the southeast. They're not on our previous tracking. Falcon Leader, can you intercept? Negative, Delta Base. We're committed to pursuit of the primary targets. We can't break off now. Sarah looked at her instruments one final time. Her aircraft was dying around her, engines failing, systems shutting down, fuel almost gone. Any reasonable pilot would continue their emergency approach and let someone else handle the new threat. But Sarah Chun had stopped being reasonable 24 minutes ago. She keyed her microphone one last time. Delta Base, this is 7-7. I still have some fight left in me. The 3 new enemy fighters were approaching Firebase Delta from the blind spot created by the mountain range. They timed their attack perfectly, waiting until the defending fighters were engaged elsewhere. In 6 minutes, they would be in position to destroy the base and everyone in it. Sarah had no fuel for extended maneuvering, no functioning defensive systems, and an aircraft that was literally falling apart around her. But she also had something the enemy didn't expect: the knowledge that sometimes impossible is just another word for necessary. She turned her dying aircraft toward the approaching threat and began her final descent, not toward safety, but toward three fresh enemy fighters who had no idea what they were about to encounter. The greatest 24 minutes in aviation history weren't quite over yet. Lieutenant Maria Santos, monitoring the radar at Firebase Delta, watched in amazement as the damaged transport aircraft changed course to intercept the new threat. "Sir, the C-130 is engaging again, but her aircraft appears to be on fire." Base Commander Colonel Williams grabbed the radio microphone. "Sarah, get the hell out of there. That's a direct order." Sarah's voice came back clear and steady, without a trace of fear. "Sylvie, Colonel, can't do that. These guys picked the wrong day to threaten my people." Through the static and engine noise, everyone listening could hear the sound of an aircraft being pushed far beyond its limits. But they could also hear something else in Sarah Chen's voice: absolute, unshakable determination. The impossible was about to become inevitable one more time. The three new enemy fighters appeared through the mountain pass like ghosts materializing from another realm. These pilots were fresh, their aircraft undamaged, and they believed they were attacking a defenseless ground installation. They had no idea that between them and their target stood one very angry transport pilot flying a dying aircraft held together by determination and prayer. Sarah C-130 was trailing smoke from two engines now, and her flight controls were responding with the sluggishness of an aircraft that should have been on the ground 10 minutes ago. But as she watched the enemy fighters approach Firebase Delta, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: absolute clarity about her purpose. These weren't just enemy aircraft. They represented every person who had ever told her she wasn't good enough, every superior officer who had questioned her capabilities, every pilot who had looked through her instead of seeing her. This was her moment to settle every account at once. "Delta Base, this is 7-7. I'm going to need you to do something for me. When I tell you, activate your emergency lighting system. All of it." Colonel Williams, monitoring from the base command center, didn't understand a request, but trusted the pilot who had just performed miracles for the past 20 minutes. "Copy, 7-7. Emergency lighting standing by." The enemy formation leader, Squadron Commander Dmitry Volkov, was feeling confident about this final phase of the mission. His intelligence had informed him that all defending fighters were engaged elsewhere, leaving the base vulnerable to attack. The damaged transport aircraft approaching their position was obviously struggling to maintain flight and posed no threat. "All aircraft, this is lead. Target the fuel depot first, then the communications array. We'll be back across the border before their fighters can respond." But as Volkov prepared to begin his attack run, something unexpected happened. The transport aircraft suddenly accelerated directly toward his formation, black smoke streaming from its engines like war banners. More disturbing, his electronic systems were beginning to register the same interference patterns that had confused the earlier attack waves. Sarah activated every remaining piece of electronic equipment she possessed, creating a signature that painted her aircraft as a massive threat on enemy radar screens. To the approaching fighters, it looked like she was carrying advanced defensive systems and possibly surface-to-air missiles. What they didn't realize was that most of her equipment was non-functional by now. She was running an elaborate bluff with systems that were operating on emergency power and failing rapidly. But sometimes the appearance of capability is more important than actual capability. The enemy formation leader made his second mistake by trying to engage the transport aircraft instead of proceeding directly to his primary target. He broke formation and turned towards Sarah's position, intending to eliminate what he perceived as a defensive threat. Sarah had been counting on exactly this response. As Volkov committed to his attack run, she executed the most dangerous maneuver of her career, a head-on pass at an enemy fighter while flying an aircraft that was barely controllable. To outside observers, it looked like suicide. Two aircraft approaching each other at a combined speed of over 800 miles per hour, with the transport pilot showing no intention of breaking off. Volkov, certain that the transport pilot would turn away at the last second, held his course while preparing to fire. But Sarah didn't turn. She'd calculated the physics of the engagement with the precision of an engineer and the instincts of a born fighter pilot. At the exact moment when collisions seemed inevitable, she deployed her final countermeasure, the C-130's emergency cargo doors. The sudden opening of the massive doors created an aerodynamic disturbance that was like flying into an invisible wall. Volkov's fighter hit the turbulent air at precisely the wrong angle and immediately lost lift on its starboard wing. The MiG-29 rolled inverted and entered an unrecoverable spin just as Sarah's aircraft passed overhead by mere feet. Volkov ejected successfully, but his aircraft impacted the mountainside in a spectacular explosion that sent debris raining across the valley. 10 down, 2 to go. But Sarah's gamble had cost her. The stress of the maneuver and the deployment of the cargo doors had damaged her aircraft's control surfaces. She was losing altitude steadily and could feel the C-130 beginning to shake apart around her. She had perhaps 60 seconds before mechanical failure forced her to crash land. The two remaining enemy fighters had witnessed their leader's destruction and were now approaching with the caution of pilots who finally understood what they were facing. They spread wide, preparing to attack from opposite directions simultaneously. Sarah looked at her instruments one final time and made a decision that would be studied in military academies for generations. Instead of trying to evade the final attack, she would create a situation where the enemy's numerical advantage became a liability. Delta Base, activate emergency lighting now. Every light on Firebase Delta suddenly blazed alive. Runway lights, building illumination, emergency beacons, vehicle headlights. The base became a brilliant beacon visible for miles in every direction. More importantly, it created exactly the visual distraction Sarah needed for her final gambit. She dove toward the illuminated base while broadcasting on all frequencies. Mayday, Mayday! Transport 77 declaring emergency. Aircraft on fire, attempting emergency landing. Clear all runways. To the two remaining enemy pilots, it appeared that their target was trying to reach safety by landing at the base. They moved to intercept, planning to destroy the transport aircraft as it approached the runway. It was a reasonable tactical decision that played directly into Sarah's hands. As the enemy fighters closed in for their final attack, Sarah suddenly pulled up from her apparent landing approach and climbed directly between them. The two MiG-29s, committed to their attack runs and blinded by the brilliant lights below, suddenly found themselves firing at each other across the path of the climbing transport aircraft. The confusion lasted only seconds, but seconds were all Sarah needed. As the enemy fighters broke off their attack to avoid collision, she activated her last operational system, the emergency beacon that would paint both aircraft as targets for the base's defensive systems. Firebase Delta's automated defense grid, designed to engage incoming missiles, locked onto the enemy fighters just as they were recovering from their confused attack runs. Surface-to-air missiles launched from concealed positions, guided by the targeting data Sarah had provided. Both enemy aircraft were destroyed within seconds of each other, their pilots never understanding how a transport plane had outmaneuvered them into a fatal trap. 12 down. Mission accomplished. Sarah's C-130 finally gave up its heroic struggle to remain airborne. With both port engines now completely failed and control surfaces barely responding, she began an emergency descent toward the Firebase Delta runway. The aircraft was shaking violently, and she could hear metal tearing somewhere behind her. Delta Base, this is 7-7 on final approach. I'm coming in hot and heavy. Have a crash crews standing by. The landing was less of a controlled descent and more of a barely managed crash. Sarah's aircraft hit the runway hard, bounced twice, and slid nearly 1,000 feet before finally coming to rest in a cloud of smoke and scattered debris. Emergency crews were racing toward the aircraft before it had completely stopped moving. Sarah sat in her pilot's seat for a long moment, hands still gripping the controls of an aircraft that had carried her through the most extraordinary 24 minutes of aerial combat in modern history. Then, she began the shutdown procedures with the calm professionalism of someone who had just completed a routine cargo flight. When the rescue crews reached her aircraft, they found Lieutenant Sarah Chun calmly filling out her post-flight report. Her first notation read, "Aircraft performed satisfactorily. Minor maintenance required." The aftermath of Sarah's engagement would reshape military aviation doctrine for years to come. 12 enemy fighters destroyed by a single transport aircraft flown by a pilot who had been relegated to cargo duty. The impossible had become reality through a combination of skill, preparation, and absolute refusal to accept limitations. Within hours, Sarah's radio transmissions were being analyzed by military intelligence agencies around the world. Her tactical innovations would be incorporated into fighter pilot training programs. Aircraft manufacturers would begin developing new defensive systems based on her improvisations. But for Sarah Chun, the most important outcome was much simpler. When Major Williams approached her hospital bed the next morning, he carried new orders that had been personally signed by the Air Force Chief of Staff. Lieutenant Chun, you're being transferred back to fighter operations. Your new assignment is as commander of Advanced Tactical Development Squadron. Your mission, teach other pilots how to think like you do. Sarah smiled and accepted the orders that returned her to the cockpit where she belonged. She'd proven that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle, that skill mattered more than perception, and that the most dangerous mistake in combat is underestimating someone based on preconceived notions. The story of the transport pilot who defeated 12 fighters in 24 minutes would be told and retold for decades. But Sarah knew the real lesson wasn't about aerial combat or tactical innovation. It was about what happens when someone refuses to accept the limitations others place on their dreams. She'd entered that morning as Lieutenant Sarah Chun, cargo pilot. She'd emerged as a legend who had redefined what was possible in the sky. And somewhere in the wreckage of 12 enemy aircraft scattered across the landscape, there was proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is a person who has something to prove. The transport pilot's war was over. The fighter pilot's legend had just begun.